Hello, everybody. This is Jonathan from Mnemonic, and we're just going to get started in a few minutes. So if you would like to have go get yourself a cup of coffee and settle down, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. The first question coming in is, will the webinar, be recorded? Yes, we are recording the webinar. We'll share the recording afterwards on our website, as well as the slides, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail during the webinar, but we'll be recording it. So grab yourself a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you so much for attending our webinar this morning. Okay, great. Well, I would love to get started and get us off on time. And the goal this morning is to do the webinar and wrap up in about 45 minutes, leaving some time for Q&A after the webinar, so we can wrap up by around 11 a.m. Eastern time. But I will stick around for as much Q&A as we have. And thank you so much for attending our webinar this morning. My name is Jonathan. I am the president, CEO, founder guy from Mnemonic. So I wear a few hats. And if you've joined a webinar before, thank you for coming back. And if this is your first webinar with Mnemonic, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to be with me this morning and discuss ISO 19600. I'm going to turn off my webcam and focus in on the slides. We are going to be sharing the recording afterwards on our blog along with the slide deck. But certainly we hope that you'll stay with us for the full hour. And if you have questions, please put them into the chat window. There's a chat window on the right-hand side where you can post questions, and I will probably tackle them towards the end of the webinar. So just put your questions in so that way you don't forget and I don't forget, and then we can go through the questions at the end. We'll also have a series of polls throughout the webinar, and please try and respond to those polls. It helps us just understand the audience and what you're looking to get out of the webinar, where you're coming from, things like that. So we have over 280, I think, registered participants this morning. So fantastic turnout, people from all around the world, from amazing companies. Some are customers, some we'd love to work with you, so don't hesitate to reach out. And we're really excited to have so many people from EHS, from regulatory affairs, from compliance management, from different backgrounds, different companies all over the world. And I hope this webinar will be helpful for everybody. So I'm going to turn off the webcam now. But again, just put your questions into the chat window and we'll get to those at the end, and keep your eye out for some polls. And I believe we have an exit survey at the end of we have an exit survey at the end of the webinar. So please, if you can complete that exit survey, that'd be greatly appreciated. Just help us improve webinars in the future, know what you enjoyed or what maybe you didn't enjoy as much. So let me turn off the webcam, and there we go. And hopefully, let me just make sure I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody should be able to see my screen on their end. If you have any technical problems, you can pop it into the chat window, though I probably won't be able to help you very much. So just make sure that you can see my screen. It should say ISO 19600 Compliance Management System. So let me get started here and just introduce myself. So I'm the CEO of Mnemonic. I do have a background in engineering, though I must admit I haven't done a lot of metallurgical engineering recently, but it is my background. And I am passionate about world-class compliance and easy to use software. That's really what we're all about at Mnemonic at a very high level. So I wanted to begin with a bit of a funny safety moment. If any of you are welding, let me click on this. I think it will take me to YouTube. So let's see if I can get this to work. And I'm just going to show you this. So in terms of, planning and compliance, this fellow maybe didn't think through the risks and the issues around welding his head into the railing that he was welding. And so just in terms of, planning, compliance, I thought this was a funny little example. Thankfully, the guy wasn't hurt. He obviously should be wearing much more personal protective equipment, but we'll leave it at that there. So let me jump back to the presentation. And there we go. All right. So our first poll is to know how many of you have heard of this standard before. So I'm kind of curious. It's not a standard that is very popular yet. It's something that was issued a few years ago, but is not something that is terribly popular. And so we wanted to highlight this standard because I think it's really an interesting standard, a guideline that a lot of companies should be looking at, but it doesn't seem to be that popular. So I'm kind of curious, how many people of you are basically hearing about this ISO standard for the first time today versus people who are already somewhat familiar with it without necessarily being an expert in it? All right, so the polls results are coming in. Yeah, so indeed, about 80% of people in this poll are saying they have not heard of the standard before, so it's new to them. So that's quite interesting, and I think it's a standard that should be getting more attention than it has gotten so far. So thank you for that poll. And then I guess the follow-up question, which is more for folks who have heard of the standard, is for those of you who've heard of the standard, are you familiar with the contents? So we're going to be going through most of the presentation today is about the contents of this standard and just get a sense of maybe you heard about it, but you don't really know what it's about. All right, so we've got about 90 or 87% of people are saying that they're not very familiar with the contents of the standard. So that's great. That means I can share some information with you today that hopefully will be helpful. All right, those are our first two polls. So thank you so much for participating in that. So this presentation can be a little bit dry. I mean, let's be honest, it is a compliance management ISO guideline. And I'm going to try and make it as entertaining as I possibly can, but there's a lot of information in the guidelines. There's a lot of information on these slides. I will be sharing the slides afterwards, so no need to write things down. And I'm going to try and make this as helpful and as entertaining as possible. I won't be reading everything on the slides. I just want to provide you with the information on the slide so that you can use it later internally with your colleagues and customers, etc. So what is ISO 19600? It is officially called a compliance management system standard, and it's really a guideline on compliance. So in contrast to other ISO standards, this one does not have requirements in it. It's really a guideline. And as of today, at least, you cannot get certified to ISO 19600. So this is more a standard that you can use to build your compliance management system, to improve your compliance management system, but it's not something that you would get certified to. It doesn't have a strict set of requirements. It's more a guideline. And it's not specific to any industry. This is a standard that is valid in basically all businesses and potentially helpful in all businesses. So it's really about establishing some principles for good governance, proportionality, transparency, sustainability, and it has 10 sections, which we're gonna review today. Here we say it does have requirements. I'd say they're not exactly requirements; they're really guidance, and therefore not a certifiable standard. And this standard is being born out of an Australian standard. So this standard came out of Australia a few years ago, and ISO adopted it. I believe it was in 2014 or 2015. ISO officially published this standard, but it does come out of Australia originally, and so we have the Aussies to thank for this one. So the standard, we're going to focus on the sections 4 to 10. Which are things that most of you will be familiar with if you're familiar with your standard, your standard, ISO standard. No pun intended there. So we're going to talk about the context of your organization, the leadership responsibilities, planning, support, operation of the guidance, performance evaluation, and improvement. And so this is what we're going to focus on today. So going through the first section, section 4, so understanding the context of your organization. This is obviously a critical first step when building out any management system. And it's really about understanding your organization, the needs and expectations of the interested parties. And that's a pretty wide net. So when we're talking about interested parties, we're going from everything from your internal interested parties within your own corporation to suppliers, stakeholders, customers, really eventually the entire supply chain of whatever goods or services you're producing. And then you want to determine the scope of compliance management system. And so scope is critical here, because if you do go through your entire supply chain all the way down, from the raw materials, and then let's say you go all the way to the other extreme to the disposal of your final product, that is a huge scope. Now, very large corporations might want to try and do that, but that's a very large scope. So I would say that when you're going through this first phase, you want to make sure you define a scope for which you have the resources to establish a compliance management program. There's no point in building out a huge scope and then not having the resources to execute on it. And this is something definitely you want to take into consideration. And the compliance management system establish what you're trying to achieve, principles of good governance. You would then typically identify compliance obligations you have, along with an analysis and evaluation of risk. So in addition to controlling your scope, you then will inevitably need to prioritize your compliance actions and issues. No company, as much as every company says and wants to be in compliance with all rules, laws, regulations, standards at all times, I think we all know that that's not really an achievable goal. And so it's very critical that you do a proper risk evaluation on your compliance issues so you can prioritize things. And in terms of scope, I'll just give one concrete example. Well, actually, let me get to that point, and then I'll give you an example on scope definition that is interesting. So understanding the organization as context, like we mentioned earlier, you need to understand your organization from the social elements of it, the cultural, where you operate, the economic, internal policies. And you want to determine both internal issues as well as external issues that are going to allow you to implement your compliance management system. And you got to understand the needs and expectations of your interested parties. So who are your stakeholders and what are their requirements? This first phase is absolutely critical. You want to make sure you bring to the table or involve the relevant people, whether they be suppliers or customers or partners or so on and so forth. And so you really need to make sure that these people are fully involved and that they understand why you want to put in place a compliance management system. Compliance can often be perceived as a cost and not as something that drives value in your business. And so it's really critical that you take the time to explain internally, as well as with your other stakeholders, why compliance is important. And I give you a long list of why compliance is important, but I think you will have a good sense of why it is important, from fines, penalties to just cleaning up messes. At the end of the day, in our opinion, at Mnemonic, compliance is about avoiding problems. It's about making sure that your business operates smoothly and that you're not spending your time trying to fix problems that have arisen because parts of your business were not in compliance with standards, regulations, procedures, so on and so forth. And then earlier we talked about determining the scope of your compliance management system. And this is really critical. We were working with one company that managed shopping centers, and they managed shopping centers all over North America and in Europe. And there was a big discussion about the scope of their responsibilities when it comes to compliance. So what were they responsible for if, for example, a tenant of theirs decided to illegally disperse some hazardous materials, hazardous chemicals into the drainage system? Who was responsible for that? Was that a compliance issue for the owner of the building, or was that a compliance issue just for that tenant? And when they went through a compliance audit, there was a big debate about who was responsible for that. So that's where a compliance management system can be helpful, because it helps you define your compliance scope. And then if you have external auditors, it helps them understand what they want, what you want to be audited. And this confusion around the scope created a whole bunch of extra costs and issues for the owner of the building. And so how wide a net you cast when it comes to compliance has a big impact on your organization. And one funny example, funny, sad, troubling example that you might have seen in the news a few months ago was in France. France is very famous for many things, including complex and arduous regulations. And so a court in France determined that a French company was liable for a worker who died when he was having extramarital affairs on a business trip after outside of work hours. So he was traveling for work, he was in another city in France and having an extramarital affair, and he died of a heart attack at night. And so, when we talk about scope of your compliance program, this I thought was an extreme example where you are responsible in some countries for, as soon as your staff are working and if they're off site, you're responsible for them, even if they're out of work hours. Everything from driving safety to, in this case, bedroom safety. So scope is very important, and countries do regulate a scope. So you want to take a look at that when you're building your program. All right. Like I said, I'm trying to make this as entertaining as possible since it is a bit of a dry topic. Compliance management and good principles of good governance. So this is about mapping out your organization's strategies and objectives. I won't go through everything here, but you do want to look at direct access of compliance functioning to the governing body. So you want to make sure that if compliance is important to your organization, you need to have somebody near the top of the food chain in your organization that is paying attention to compliance, that's reporting to compliance, and making sure that that's feeding its way to the C-suite or the executive. And it has to be independent. So I think it kind of goes without saying that if you want people to take compliance seriously, there shouldn't be any interference. You shouldn't have managers or VPs or business units saying, well, we got to meet our sales objectives this month. We can't necessarily pay attention to all these rules and regulations. And then the compliance function needs to have enough authority and adequate resources to do their job. So one classic example, in the financial industry, we watch some of those movies about 2008 or other financial crises, is they have a compliance officer, but that compliance officer does not have the resources to do his job, and it's really just a false position that they put in place for regulatory reasons. And of course, we are advocating the exact opposite of that. All right. So compliance obligations. So this is a core part of what Mnemonic does, is we help businesses pull together their compliance obligations. So that means laws, regulations, orders, guidance, treaties, conventions. I mean, the average facility that we work with has, when you pull everything together, when you're talking about stakeholder engagements, permitting requirements, organizational policies, laws, and regulations, the average facility, I think we could have done a poll about this, has 1,500 compliance obligations, 1,500 compliance obligations. And that's for your sort of standard manufacturing operation. We're not talking about heavy industries such as oil and gas or chemicals, but the average manufacturing facility has about 1,500 compliance obligations. So you probably have a lot more than you think. Perhaps we should have done a poll on this, but you got to build out this system, and then you got to maintain it. And I'd say that's where one of the biggest challenges is people build out a long list of compliance obligations, but it's in an Excel spreadsheet or even in a environmental health safety management software or in a risk management software, GRC, but it's not maintained. And if it's not maintained, it quickly goes out of date. And then once it's out of date, people don't want to use it anymore. And it's a vicious cycle. So maintenance is critical. And I'd say, of course, I have a biased opinion, but I'd say the best way to do that is by working with trusted suppliers who can help you maintain your at least regulatory and standards-based compliance obligations. And then identification, analysis, and evaluation of risk. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. Risk evaluation is a whole separate topic that is quite interesting. but you want to do your typical risk analysis on your compliance. So, what's the severity of a non-compliance, whether we're talking about fines, whether we're talking about worker injury, product delays, things like that, and what's the likelihood of it happening. So I'd love to say that you should be in compliance with everything all the time, but to be frank, you need to rank your risks of non-compliance, and human health, death, things like that obviously should be at the top of the list, but as well as financial risks related to products not getting to market. Sorry. So next step is leadership, and this is section number 5. I'm just going to check the time, make sure we're on time here. So leadership and commitment, compliance policy, organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. So I think we can all agree that most change starts at the top, at least in a corporate environment or an organizational environment. So leadership is absolutely critical to your compliance program. If the leadership is not communicating the importance of compliance, I can almost guarantee you that compliance will not be taken seriously by the other members of the team. So you need to have a policy, we'll talk about that, but the leadership really needs to buy into compliance as a business driver. If they think compliance is simply a cost, they're not going to allocate the resources, they're not going to talk about it in team meetings, they're not going to put it as part of the objectives for the quarter. So at the top, there has to be a strong commitment to compliance. So the policy, you want to build a strong policy, and you don't want a policy that's just going to sit on a bookshelf. The policy needs to be available to everybody. It needs to be written in plain language so everybody understands it. It needs to be clearly communicated and updated as required. And I definitely recommend putting up the policy in the entrance of your building, both for yourselves as a reminder, as well as for customers that are walking in. This is especially true if you have facilities all around the world in countries where perhaps there's some bribery issues, where there's some corruption issues. Making compliance front and center of your business culture is absolutely critical, and a policy in the entrance is really, really important. And now, of course, a policy doesn't solve all your problems, but in my opinion, it's very critical. And I've seen this. We do a lot of work in China, and of course, China has had some issues in the past around corruption and bribery, but both the government and companies there have been taking very, very serious action against that. And so a lot of buildings, both government and private corporations, you'll see very strong policies when you walk into the building that are very clear. And that's a critical step. So I guess a poll here is, are you familiar, or sorry, does your organization have a compliance policy? And I would say, I would contextualize this a little bit by saying, does your organization have a compliance policy, and could you maybe not say it verbatim from heart, but could you kind of give the contours of that policy without looking it up? Because I think it's one thing to know we have a policy, it's another thing to know what that policy says. And so it looks like the results are coming in still, but about 80% are saying you do have a policy and 20% say you don't. So that's interesting. And again, I would say, let us know if you know kind of what the policy says, and not just that this policy exists in a abstract sort of way. All right, so it's gone down a little bit. 75% have a policy and 25% don't. So 25% is still substantial. You would think the compliance with laws, regulations, and standards would be a core thing in all businesses, but it's not. So organizational roles and responsibilities. There's a lot of bullet points here. I'm not going to go through everything, but top management is really critical. We discussed that earlier, and it's critical in terms of driving the business, providing training, and issuing corrective actions or taking corrective action when issues are raised. Compliance functions. So it's important to have a compliance officer or a chief compliance officer, some companies will call it, who establishes the policies and make sure that the resources are there to execute and ensure compliance across the board. And then a compliance function. So here, it's really critical that you have actual people going out and doing audits, assessing risks, identifying compliance obligations, and mapping those to your organization. So you can't just have one chief compliance officer. You need to have people who actually have responsibilities. And It's very difficult if you have people who have multiple hats, where they are simultaneously involved in production and they also have to do compliance related tasks, because sometimes, quite frankly, those do come into contradiction, where the production guy says, well, we don't have time to do this in full compliance with this standard. We got to do it quickly because we got to get stuff out the door for our customers. And so there it can become very challenging if you're wearing two hats, one on production and one in compliance. So my recommendation is to try and separate that as much as possible, and to have people involved in compliance be strictly involved in compliance. Now, they can have multiple types of compliance, like quality, environmental, safety, and other types of compliance, security, public safety. But it is important that you separate them from your general operational staff. And then employees, obviously they need to be trained, they need to understand the culture, and they need to understand the priorities of the organization. And compliance culture, I guess, would be one last message on leadership. Is we talk a lot about safety culture, and safety culture is very important. I don't want to say it's not, but getting compliance culture is really critical, and it's a relentless battle. You have to constantly be communicating. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Planning. So really 2 points here: actions to address compliance risks, and then compliance objectives and planning to achieve them. So in terms of actions to address compliance risks, once you've identified your risks, you've documented them, you need to plan how you're going to address them, plan how you're going to integrate this into your compliance management system process, and how to evaluate the effectiveness of the actions. So you need to really identify actions that are going to bring you into compliance, and you want to make sure you're evaluating the effectiveness of these actions. It's one thing to do an action, it's a whole other thing to determine whether or not that action is achieving the goals that you had set out. Because a lot of actions may only be patchwork, they may be temporary. Does the action address your root cause of a non-compliance? And then compliance objectives and planning to achieve them. So you want to make sure you plan carefully, determine what's, basically it's those classic what, when, who, how, and also why. We don't have that on this slide, but the why is just as important as all of this, because if people don't understand why we're doing something, it often will fall apart very quickly. So what's going to be done, what resources are required, who's responsible, when is it to be done, and how are the results going to be evaluated, and why are we doing this? And we can find lots of examples of non-compliance. I did a webinar a couple months ago on non-compliance that led to large-scale industrial disasters, and that is available on our website. If you would like a copy, just send me an email at jbrun@mnemonic.com. But lots and lots of examples of non-compliance that cost companies lots of money, or unfortunately kills people. And then you got to make sure you document all of this. So it's one thing to talk about this in a meeting, but you want it to be documented, clearly communicated to all of your stakeholders that are involved in your compliance management system. So number 7, support. So support, you need to have the resources. We've talked about that a bit: competence and training, awareness, communication, and documented information. So when we talk about resources, of course, there's a whole bunch. We talk about financial, human, in terms of having the people with the skill set to do it, IT and technology, access to external advice. So you need to have kind of this whole pizza pie of resources. It is really hard to do compliance with if you're missing parts of it. And one caution about IT is we've seen companies that go out and buy a fancy software, either GRC, EHS, compliance, and software is important. We sell software at Mnemonic, but if you don't build your system first, if you don't plan, figure out your resource allocation, figure out your project plan first, the IT is going to make things worse. So you really only want to go out and buy a software once you've built a system and you've operated it for a little while, and you have a really good understanding of what your organization needs to do, what it can do, and then you can try and find the right product to support your system. And so top management needs to make sure that they understand this is critical to the business, and that they give you the sufficient resources to execute on your compliance management system. So competence and training. So first step, which a lot of companies don't do, is determine competence. Um, it's one thing to say that you have an understanding of compliance or an understanding of a specific domain like environment or safety or product quality. It's a whole other thing to determine whether or not people actually have those competencies. And then once you've determined that, build out training, potentially hire people, ensure competence on an ongoing basis, and maintain documentation when there's staff turnover, when there's changes. And that's really, really critical. And I could do a whole webinar on documentation, which is a whole bag of challenges. But competence and training, really critical. Make sure you have the right people. And if you don't have the right people, either hire them or train them. You have to take that very seriously. Awareness. So we talked earlier about the critical element of top management. Top management needs to build a policy. They need to communicate its importance, and they got to clearly communicate the implications of not conforming with the compliance management system requirements. If you have the policy, you have the system, but nobody ever gets punished for non-compliance or nothing ever happens related to non-compliance, it will slowly erode and people will not take it seriously. We could find lots of corporate examples where, in theory, compliance was part of the core company policies, but nobody really took it seriously. We go back to Enron, where they had a whole compliance policy, they had a whole bunch of stuff, and nevertheless, tremendous fraud was conducted. More recently, Volkswagen with the diesel emissions. So there's lots and lots of examples of companies that have great policies. Top management says they find this important, that this is important for the organization, but when the rubber meets the road, nothing is done. And so the implications is critical, and that's what's going to allow you to build a compliance culture, because a culture at the end of the day is a set of rules and conventions that are applied. If nobody ever applied them, the culture wouldn't be established. So you got to apply the rules. And you can see a little bit this circle that we've drawn on those slides. Communication. So an organization has to determine when and how to share relevant information about compliance, and you got to adopt appropriate methods of communication to ensure that everybody's heard this. It's not enough to send out an email or put it up on a billboard. There needs to be, I think the best way to communicate the importance of compliance is through stories. And so you can very easily find stories of non-compliance causing the downfall of companies or causing huge financial and human fraud. You can take my webinar from 3 months ago and use that internally, or you can make a list of quality issues that sunk companies. The list is really long. So you need to communicate it, and in my opinion, stories are the best way to get the message across. So quick poll, this is our last poll, I think. How many times do you have to repeat something for people to create a habit? So how many times do you have to basically say, for example, compliance is important and compliance matters to our business before it really gets ingrained in people's minds? So let me let the survey come in here. This is always an interesting one. And of course, you can find different studies that say different things. All right, let me close the poll. So we have 17% of people are saying that it's 6 times, 46% of people saying 16 times, 21% say 66 times, and 16% say 166 times. So the answer is, drum roll, the answer is 66 times, or at least based on the research that we found, you have to repeat something 66 times to create a new habit. And I think anybody with children probably already knows this. So you got to repeat stuff a lot. And we are all bombarded with so much information every day, whether it's our emails, our messages, our apps. So getting people's attention, getting them to understand something, it takes a lot of effort. So 66 times, it's a lot. All right, documented information. Again, I won't go through all the points here. The short version of this slide is you got to document. And if you don't document things, when the people change, you're going to lose a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge. So you need to have records, logs. And there's 4 types of documentations. I found this really interesting. And I could share an article about this if folks are interested, but you have how-to guides, so how to do something. You have tutorials, which is a learning type of documentation. You then have documentation that explains the technical details of a system, and then documents that are reference documents that give you like terminology and just nomenclature. So you want to think of your documentation in some ways in those four kind of buckets. And I could share that article. I think it's quite interesting, the different types of documentation that the companies need to have. Operation. All right, so 3 points in operation. Operational planning and control, establishing controls and procedures, and outsource process. So operational planning and control, the organization should plan processes needed to meet the compliance objectives and address compliance risks. So you got to define your objectives, establish criteria, implement controls, and then document process information. So operations really need to take this seriously because a lot of what happens with all management systems, it's not specific to compliance management systems, is that you build it out, you do all this hard work around scoping, around responsibilities, around documentation, around leadership. And then when it comes to the actual operations and getting it into your operations, that's where the wheels fall off the truck. And the operators say, I just don't have time for this. I'm too busy. We can't adjust this procedure, this process. And so this is an area where I want to make sure that everybody who's doing this puts aside the appropriate time to work with your operators. Don't just hand them something and say, hey, you got to follow this compliance requirement or else. You need to work with them so that it's embedded in their system. It needs to be easy to follow. Ideally, if you can automate certain things, that's the best. Exception reports, when sometimes you do have to do an exception, baking it into employee performance, compliance assessments, and then that communication element. And so you need to work with your operators to make sure that the policies, the procedures, and the controls are really embedded into the operations in a way that's not disruptive to your team. And so anything you can do that's passive, like ongoing monitoring, automated tests, definitely highly recommended. You want to minimize any sort of human element here as much as possible, but you will need to do some human elements. But work closely with your operators. Again, explain them the why, explain to them, the why, and then you can work on the who, what, when, and how. Outsource processes. So any outsourced work, it's more and more common for companies to outsource, to hire temporary workers, contractors, to try and get things off of their payroll and into separate companies. But that doesn't mean you don't have to pay attention to compliance in your outsourced process. So contractors, people coming on site, suppliers, all of this has a huge impact on your business. If a supplier is out of compliance, it can throw your entire supply chain, send your entire supply chain to a grinding halt. There was an example in China last year of an auto parts company that had a series of environmental non-compliances. The government shut down this auto parts supplier, and anybody who works in the auto industry knows that you've got a very limited inventory of pieces on your assembly line. And so a number of auto manufacturers had to shut down their assembly lines for 2 or 3 days because this supplier was shut down. And you can only imagine the cost related to that. So looking at your supply chain, look at your outsourced parties, everything from the company that takes care of your cafeteria to the people supplying you with critical parts for your equipment. Performance evaluation. There's really 3 key elements here: monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation, audits, and then management review. So monitoring and measurement, I think we can all agree that if you don't monitor something and you don't measure it, it's not going to improve. So you need to determine what needs to be measured, what are the critical things you're measuring for, how and when will it be measured, and how are you going to report on the results. You can't measure everything. So you got to, again, prioritize what you're going to measure. What are the key indicators within your compliance that's going to allow you to determine if the system is operating properly? And this, of course, should be related somewhat to the risk evaluation you did earlier on your compliance obligations. And you want to seek feedback from your staff, from operators, again, to make sure that whatever you're asking them to do is realistic and feasible, and you want to report on non-compliance. Make sure you have lots of channels to gather information about non-compliance, because when you have non-compliance happening all the way down, say at the operator level or with some outsourced parties, if people don't have an easy way to report an issue, they won't report it. And so this could be a hotline, it could be a text messaging system, it could be a simple email, anonymous email inbox that you set up. But you need to make it really easy for people to report. You also need to remind them to report with posters on site, with communication on site. The best source of implementing a compliance management system and making sure people are respecting it is your own staff, and make sure they have an easy way to report issues. Because far too often people say, people only did it once, it's not a big deal, it's going to take me too much effort to report this, so I won't report it. And then you want to analyze the information. So you need to have the information in a data warehouse or somewhere where you can actually process it, a business intelligence tool. But I just want to emphasize here, because I do see a trend sometimes where people say, oh, we'll just gather lots of data and that will allow us to find our problems. And I personally am not a big believer in that. Data is important, but many companies don't gather the right data. They just gather lots of data. And then it's very, very hard to draw any sort of meaningful conclusions. So in terms of monitoring, measurement, analysis, you want to really take the time up front to think about what are the key things we need to be monitoring and measuring. And that's the data you want to be gathering. You don't just need to gather as much data as possible across your organization, because too much data is just as bad as not enough data. So you want to get the right data, and that needs to be done based on your operations, your risk analysis. And so, I won't go through all the points on this slide, but we can talk about development of indicators. So you do want to have a sense of like, okay, if we hit this threshold, there's clearly a problem. How are you going to report on those problems? What's the content of your compliance reports? And then record keeping. So you need to have that, you want to make this full circle here, from monitoring all the way down to record keeping. And the indicators is obviously critical, coming back to that point earlier of identifying the right things to measure. Your indicators on those items are critical. And ideally you progressively lower them. So every year you have less and less tolerance for non-compliance. So audits. Every organization should be conducting audits. First-party audits where you're auditing yourself, second-party audits where somebody from another facility is coming, and then third-party audits. Now, audits are not, some people say, oh, to assess compliance, we're just going to do an audit every quarter, every year, every 3 years. And I would argue that that is definitely not sufficient. Audits are helpful, but audits should really be viewed as one of the last steps in your compliance program. It should be viewed as a way to check that people are respecting the compliance program, that they're taking the actions they said they would, and that the actions have their effectiveness that's desired. But you can't just audit, because auditors are human. And inevitably, certain auditors will lean in certain directions. They have better knowledge in certain directions. And a lot of experienced auditors, they're not working off a robust list of compliance obligations. They're walking around a facility. They've done so many facilities that they have a good sense of what the big problems are, but it's not necessarily thorough. And getting a thorough compliance management program, the only way to do that is by doing all the work we've already discussed, that upfront work of scoping and risk analysis and responsibility mapping. So auditing, super important, but it's not a panacea. And you want to define the audit criteria, use the scope that you've already identified. You can have a narrower scope for smaller audits. You want to make sure that the auditors are objective. That comes back to that thing earlier about making sure that people don't have two hats. And then making sure that this data is acted upon and used. You don't want to just do an audit to have a report sit on the shelf. And then the last point within 9.3 is management reviews. So you want to determine whether or not the compliance initiatives you've taken are having the desired effect, because you can put in place a policy or a procedure or a process that can have lots of effects that you didn't think of, both good and bad. And you want to make sure that management is regularly reviewing, is our compliance management system achieving the compliance goals we had? Is it creating new problems that maybe we don't want to have in the first place? And you want to review your resources, review your responsibilities, and any opportunities for improvements. And then you want to recommend changes to the program on an ongoing basis. And this is a lot of work. I don't want to pretend that this is not a lot of work, but management needs to review it. And then one interesting article that I came across recently, I think we've heard a little bit about, most of us have seen in the news some of the air pollution crises in India. And this is due to the air pollution crisis is due to a whole variety of issues. But one interesting element is that a new regulation that was put out in the area around Delhi led to air pollution getting a lot worse. And that regulation had to do with conserving water. They changed the period of the year when farmers could collect their grains or their produce and burn some of the remaining material. And they changed this to conserve water because they're running out of water. And so they delayed it later in the season. But what happened was that regulation made farmers burn their excess material later in the season, and that compounded with weather patterns and with some habits in India to create kind of a perfect storm of air pollution. So hopefully India is reevaluating this regulation along with others. There's obviously a lot of other reasons for the air pollution. But the point here is when you do your management review, look both for the good stuff as well as the bad stuff, as well as the unintended consequences, because there will always be unintended consequences. And the last element to discuss is element 10, which is improvement. So talking about non-conformity, non-compliance, and then continual improvement. So non-conformities, when you do find non-compliance, it's really critical that you take action and take action quickly. Try and eliminate the root cause, determine if similar nonconformities exist. This can be done through some data analysis, and then review the effectiveness of the corrective action. So one thing that we do at Mnemonic with our system is if you issue a corrective action, you're then prompted to issue an effectiveness assessment 6 months to 1 year later. So you go back and you determine whether or not that corrective action had the desired effects. And you want to manage this, manage the consequences of your non-compliance. And we could have a whole discussion on that as well. Continued improvement. So act, plan, do, and check. I think we're all familiar with that. The organization needs to seek to continuously improve the effectiveness of the compliance management system, and the information needs to be collected and evaluated. So continuous improvement, you want to have that virtuous cycle. Here is a somewhat more complex view of this standard workflow. So if you tie like all the different elements we've talked about today together, it would look something like this. I won't go through it because it's just, you see it on the slides and you can have a look at it later. But you want to really make sure you're regularly assessing and improving your systems, as you would with any management system. So, in summary, I'd say a successful compliance program, first and foremost, is following 19,600, using that as a guideline, pulling all your information together, pulling your people together, and getting away from a siloed compliance approach. One of the big challenges I see, at least a trend, is companies that have siloed their compliance. Say, okay, environment, you're responsible for environmental compliance, and safety, you're this, and quality, you're that. And then they each go out on their own way. They each buy their own software. They each build their own system. And it becomes very hard to pull all of that data together, to have a coherent picture, and to bake it into your culture. And so centrally managing and using 19,600 as a guidance to centrally manage your compliance, in my opinion, is critical to taking your business to the next level, because those silos create all sorts of extra costs, communication costs, but they're also often buying software in duplicate, they're buying systems in duplicate, they're buying consulting services in duplicate. So centralizing your compliance program can be a huge cost saver and have lots of other benefits. Software solutions can be helpful, but again, you only want to buy a software solution once you've mapped out your compliance issues, and Mnemonic is happy to help, but there's lots of other products on the market. And taking a comprehensive compliance approach. So at Mnemonic, we work with companies to build out a comprehensive compliance program, which is heavily based on 19,600. I've talked about the software. These are some stats on just the cost of managing regulatory requirements. If we come back to something I said earlier, which was that there's 1,500 compliance obligations for every facility. A lot of those compliance obligations are changing every year because the governments are changing the regulations. And if you're in multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, it makes it even more important to have trusted suppliers helping you monitor all of this. And then comprehensive compliance approach, I touched on briefly. Mnemonic goes through a 7-step process, heavily based on 19,600. This is a bit of a simplified version of 19,600, and we work with companies to implement this and to do it for their organization. And we do it through helping you identify your compliance obligations, all the individual requirements you need to meet, and then implementing an auditing tool to make sure that you're in compliance and that your actions are effective. And we often do this in through a one-day workshop. So this is not a sales pitch. I hope this webinar was educational for everybody. But if you are interested in doing a one-day workshop where we start to map out what a compliance program would look like for your organization, or to take what you already have and improve it, we do that in one day. We send an expert on site, or we do it remote. You can type workshop into the chat window or into the questions if you're interested in learning more, and I can send you an email. But basically, we go through the 7 steps, and the steps are mapped to 19,600. At the end of the day, you walk away with a framework that you can then go and start to implement, and start to gather information, put all the pieces of Humpty Dumpty back together and try and centralize your compliance program. So this has been a fantastic workshop with companies all around the world, and I think everybody walks away with it with a better understanding of what their priorities are for compliance. So huge thank you for attending this morning. I hope I managed to make this as interesting as possible. Text workshop in the chat window if you're interested. You can also send us an email or give us a call, and we'd be thrilled to work with you. So let me stop here, and I'm going to try and pull up the questions tab. So I got quite a few questions. All right, we're going to go through the questions in order. I'll do my best to answer them. And I'll pop up my webcam as well so you can see me. And let's see if I can read some questions. So the first question we answered was, is it going to be recorded? Yes, so we've recorded this webinar, and we'll share the recording with you later. What year was ISO 19600 issued? It was in 2014, and that is when it came out. It was based on an Australian standard. Ron mentioned that it's not a standard; it is a guideline. Yeah, I would say it's definitely a guideline. It's not a certifiable standard. I totally agree with you. So you may answer this. So this is Bob who's asking, how does this impact the environmental management system? So that's a good question. And whether it's environmental management system or safety management system or something else, you probably already have those in place. And we don't want to start everything over from scratch. I'm sure your environmental colleagues, or if you're the environmental manager, you've done a lot of hard work. But a comprehensive compliance program is about tying all your compliance elements together. So if you have a great environmental management standard, like a system based on a standard put in place, you will want to tie that in and potentially prioritize some of the elements within the environment standard and roll them into a general compliance and use it to inform other compliance issues, whether it's safety or quality. So that's, don't start over from scratch. But environment has its own issues, safety has its own issues. A compliance management program is about establishing sort of the overall structure, and then as you dig down, you can get it. If you don't have anything, I would argue that you should start with a general compliance management program and then work your way down into the individual issues like environment and safety. But if you have something, you want to try and recover it and roll it into a generalized program and standardize it. So ideally, if you have the same kind of structure and documentation, the same structure for environment as you do for safety as you do for quality, the details, of course, will be different, but the same structure, it will help people navigate those systems much more easily. And that, I think, is about what that is what ISO 19600 is about. So Marwin said this is the exact 10 items of ISO 14001. So I think that was just about the first slide. And so that is hopefully this slides cover everything you were looking for. Somebody asked, what's the difference between this and CSA Z733? Does Canada recognize the standard, as we've heard the US does not? To be perfectly honest, I'm not super familiar with CSA Z733. I'm gonna have to go look it up off the top of my head. But there are like so one of the reasons why ISO 19600 has not maybe received the popularity that it could have was because ISO simultaneously or very nearby published some anti-bribery standards, and those kind of got a little bit more traction. And of course, compliance and bribery kind of go hand in hand. So there's been a bit more of a focus, especially in the financial sector and in certain industries around anti-bribery, also because there's been a number of very large fines levied against companies. So I think that's part of the reason why ISO 19600 has gotten a lot of attention. I'm just not that familiar with Z733, so I don't want to venture a guess, but I will definitely take a look and try and better understand that. But in general, CSA standards are Canadian. And so typically other countries wouldn't recognize them. So if the CSA standard is based on an international standard, then other companies, will recognize it. But if it's a purely Canadian one, that might be the issue. But I'm just not familiar with that standard. Okay, is this geared towards? Rick is asking, is this geared more towards manufacturer as opposed to an engineering services company? I would say no. Like compliance, if you're an engineering services company, compliance is super important. We work with a lot of engineering services companies, and this goes everything from like obtaining contracts, and so we're talking about like bribery and corruption issues there, price fixing. I'm from Montreal in Quebec, and if any of you have seen in the news in the last few years, we had a lot of bribery and corruption issues around engineering companies that were bidding on projects, price fixing, things like that. So compliance applies to everybody. And if you're an engineering services company, there's the contract compliance, HR compliance, and then if you're on site with your customers, there's going to be operational compliance as well. So I would say this applies to everybody. Obviously, the scope, the priorities will be different from a manufacturer as it is for, say, a consulting or an engineering company, but definitely relevant. Do you need a special designation to establish, implement, and audit an ISO 19600 compliance management system guidelines? So my understanding is no, you don't, because this is not a certifiable standard like ISO 14001 or other standards. You can establish this system, you can follow it, and you can say that you're following ISO 19600. You can't get certified as of today. So I don't believe you need any special certification, but don't hold me to that. Any special designation, of course, a background in auditing is going to be critical. Familiarity with management systems, really critical. But I don't think you need to focus on that. Does Mnemonic offer access to the ISO standards with a subscription? Unfortunately, we do not. I wish we could. We've tried for many years. One thing we do though, is we monitor all the standards for changes, and then we try and explain the changes about relevant standards to our customers. So we do offer a service where we monitor standards for changes, whether they be ISO, CSA, NFPA, or others. When the standard is freely available, we give access to our customers. But unfortunately, ISO and other standards, we have not been able to negotiate a copyright. So a couple people asked about the workshop presentation materials. So we will send. Okay. So we'll send the presentation materials by email along with the video. And I think Evan is saying. Evan here is saying that the person earlier who was asking about the CSA standard actually meant CSA standard Z773, which is environmental compliance auditing standard. So yeah, that would be different. And Evan is saying, and I agree with him here, that standard, the Z773, would help fulfill performance evaluation components. And so yes, it'll help you fulfill Section 9, but it's on replacement. As to whether or not it's recognized in the US, I don't know. Maybe Evan knows. Maybe he's more familiar with this standard than I am. But you can certainly send us an email, and I can put you in touch with Evan if that's okay with both of you. I have your emails in the registration form, so I can put that in touch if you would like to be put in touch. Not really recognized in the US is what Evan is saying. Okay, thank you, Evan, for that point. So yeah, Z773 as many CSA standards, they're not really recognized in the US because this one I don't know, but others at least are Canadian specific. So how could you possibly keep abreast of HSE compliance obligations on a global scale, by Rick? Yeah, that's a big challenge. So we offer a service in Mnemonic where we have 200,000 documents in the database. They're all pretty much all HSE documents for 40 countries, 350 jurisdictions if you count the states and the provinces and the municipalities. So basically, my short answer is you got to buy a service. You can buy from us. You can buy from companies like Inhesa. You can buy from, there's a few companies that do it on a global scale. But you got to buy a service. People who try to do it themselves usually get discouraged. We have a team of like 20 people doing this, so it's a full-time job to say the least. Okay, great. I think we've gone through all the questions. If anybody has a last-minute question, let me know. I do want to respect everybody's time and finish on time here at 11. If you have other questions, please don't hesitate to send us an email, give us a call. We would certainly be keen to discuss how you're handling compliance and whether or not we can help. I will send a copy of the presentation along with the video in the next couple days. And have a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah, and I hope you have a very safe holidays. Be safe on the road and be safe with your families, and have a great holiday season, and hope to work with you in 2020. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.